Every morning begins quietly, but your mind rarely does. Before the day has even had a chance to unfold, something inside you is already active, already moving, already pulling pieces from the past and projecting them into the future. You wake up, and almost instantly, thoughts begin to gather. Things you said yesterday, things you should have said, things that might happen today, things that could go wrong. None of it has happened yet, but it already feels real. And without realizing it, you begin carrying a weight that this moment never asked you to carry. It feels normal because you've done it for so long. It even feels responsible, like you're preparing yourself, staying alert, staying ahead. But if you look closely, most of what drains you throughout the day isn't what actually happens. It's everything your mind adds before anything even begins. There's a quiet habit underneath all of this, one that forms so early and grows so naturally that you rarely question it. The habit of turning simple moments into something heavier than they are. A neutral situation becomes a personal concern. A small delay becomes a sign of something bigger. A passing comment becomes something you replay over and over again, trying to understand what it meant about you. It happens quickly. So quickly that you don't even notice the exact moment it begins. 1 second, something small happens. The next, your mind has already built a story around it. A story that feels convincing, a story that feels important, but a story that often has very little to do with reality itself. And the more this happens, the more everything starts to feel significant. Every detail feels like it matters. Every moment feels like it needs your attention, your reaction, your interpretation. But when everything feels important, nothing is filtered. And when nothing is filtered, everything becomes heavy. You carry that heaviness into everything, into conversations, where you're not just listening but analyzing, into decisions where you're not just choosing but worrying about every possible outcome, even into quiet moments where instead of resting your mind continues to move, continues to search, continues to hold on. After a while you stop questioning it. You begin to believe that this is just how life feels. That constant tension, that background noise, that sense of pressure. But it isn't life. It's the way your mind has learned to interact with it. And the moment you begin to notice that, even slightly, something shifts. Not outside you, nothing around you suddenly changes. But inside, there's a small opening, a space that wasn't there before, because instead of immediately following every thought, you begin to observe it. At first this feels subtle, almost insignificant. A thought appears, and instead of fully stepping into it, you pause. You see it, you recognize it as a thought, not as a fact. And in that small moment of awareness, something important happens. You create distance. That distance may only last a second, but it changes everything. Because now, not every thought feels true. Not every interpretation feels convincing. You begin to see that some thoughts don't need your agreement. They can simply exist and pass without becoming something more. This is where clarity begins to take shape, not by controlling what happens around you, but by understanding what happens within you, because most moments don't actually require a reaction. They pass on their own, quietly, naturally, but the mind doesn't always allow that. It holds on, it replays, it builds layers around something that was originally simple, and over time, that becomes exhausting. So the shift isn't about forcing your mind to stop. It isn't about pushing thoughts away or trying to silence everything. It's about noticing when something small begins to turn into something complex. It's about catching that moment and allowing yourself to pause. That pause is small, but it interrupts everything. At first, it won't feel easy. The pull of old habits is strong. The urge to analyze, to react, to personalize everything, it feels automatic. But with awareness, something begins to change. You start to realize that not everything needs your involvement. Some things can exist without becoming something bigger. Some thoughts can appear without needing to be followed. And as you begin to see that more clearly, the weight you've been carrying starts to loosen, not because life has become easier, but because you've stopped making it heavier than it needs to be. There's another layer to this that often goes unnoticed. It's not just the thoughts themselves, but the way you hold on to situations. There's a kind of tension that runs quietly in the background of your day, a constant tightening, a subtle effort to make sure everything goes right, to prevent mistakes, to control outcomes. It feels like you're being careful. It feels like you're being aware. But underneath that, there's strain. You can feel it in small moments, waiting for a reply that hasn't come yet, and your mind starts to drift into possibilities, replaying a conversation, wondering if you said the right thing, holding on to how something should go so tightly that even a small change feels unsettling. These moments may seem different, but they all come from the same place, not from the situation itself, but from the way you're holding it. Imagine holding something delicate in your hands. Your instinct might be to grip it tightly so it doesn't fall. But the tighter you hold, the more your hands tense, the more unstable your movements become. The very act of trying to secure it begins to create instability. But when you loosen your grip just enough, something shifts. Your hands become steadier. Your movements become smoother. You're still holding it, but you're no longer fighting it. Life works in a similar way. Most of the tension you feel doesn't come from what you're carrying, but from how tightly you're trying to carry it. You hold on to outcomes as if they must happen a certain way. You hold on to expectations as if they must be met. And in doing so, you create pressure that doesn't come from reality but from resistance. At first, letting go of that tight grip feels uncomfortable. It feels like losing control. Like if you don't hold on as firmly, things might fall apart. But if you look closely, you'll begin to notice something important. Most things were never fully in your control to begin with. The way someone responds to you, the timing of events, the outcome of situations. These things have always existed outside your reach. The only difference now is that you're no longer exhausting yourself trying to manage them. And as that realization settles in, your experience begins to change. The same situations are still there, the same uncertainties, the same unpredictability. But internally something feels different. There's less tension, less urgency, less pressure to force everything into place. You begin to move through moments instead of pushing against them. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care differently. You still show up, you still act, you still give effort, but you're no longer tying your sense of peace to outcomes you can't control. You're no longer gripping so tightly that every small change feels like a threat. Instead, there's a kind of flexibility that begins to grow, a quiet steadiness that doesn't depend on everything going perfectly. And over time, this way of moving through life starts to feel more natural. Things that once felt overwhelming begin to pass more easily. Delays don't carry the same weight. Uncertainty doesn't feel as heavy. Even setbacks begin to feel different, not because they're pleasant, but because they no longer define your entire state of mind. There's a kind of freedom in that. Not the kind that comes from controlling everything, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to. And this is often where people misunderstand everything. The idea of caring less can sound like stepping away from life, like becoming distant, unmotivated, disconnected. But that's not what this is. This isn't about caring less in a careless way. It's about caring in a clearer way. It's about removing the unnecessary weight that comes from trying to control what was never yours to control. It's about separating what truly matters from what you've been conditioned to believe matters, because there's a difference between attachment and commitment. Attachment is rigid. It demands a specific outcome. It creates tension because it resists anything that doesn't match its expectations. Commitment is steady. It focuses on your effort, your actions, your presence. It allows things to unfold while you continue to show up fully. And when you begin to see the difference, something becomes clear. You can be deeply committed to something without being attached to how it turns out. You can give your best effort without tying your worth to the result. You can care without carrying unnecessary pressure. And when that shift happens, everything you do begins to feel different. Your work becomes more focused because you're not constantly distracted by outcomes. Your relationships become more genuine because you're not trying to control how others feel. Your thoughts become quieter because you're not reacting to everything. there's a calm that starts to form, not because life is perfectly stable, but because you are. And that calm becomes something you can return to again and again, even when things don't go as planned, even when uncertainty appears, even when your mind tries to pull you back into old patterns. You begin to recognize those patterns more quickly. You see when your thoughts start to spiral. You notice when you begin to take things personally. You feel when tension starts to build. And instead of being carried away by it, you pause. That pause becomes your anchor. It gives you space to choose instead of react. And in that space, something powerful begins to grow. A sense of control that isn't about controlling the world, but about understanding yourself. A sense of clarity that doesn't depend on everything making sense, but on your ability to remain steady even when it doesn't. A sense of peace that isn't fragile, but quietly resilient. And as this continues, something deeper begins to settle in. You start to realize that much of what once felt heavy was never truly yours to carry. It was built from thoughts that didn't need to be followed, from expectations that didn't need to be held, from reactions that didn't need to happen. And as you begin to let those go, even slowly, your experience of life begins to change in a way that feels both simple and profound. Not because the world has become lighter, but because you have. And as that lightness begins to settle into your experience, you start to notice something that was always there, but hidden beneath the noise. There is a natural ease to life that doesn't require force, doesn't require constant correction, doesn't require you to hold everything together all the time. For a long time, it may have felt like if you weren't actively managing everything, things would fall apart. Like your attention, your worry, your constant thinking was somehow holding your life in place. But as you begin to step back from that pattern, even slightly, you start to see that life continues to move, to unfold, to adjust on its own. Not perfectly, not always in the way you expect, but in a way that doesn't require your constant tension. This realization doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small moments. A situation that would have once consumed your thoughts passes more quietly. A delay that would have triggered frustration feels manageable. A conversation that would have stayed in your mind for hours fades naturally. And in those moments you begin to feel something different, a kind of space that wasn't there before. That space is important, because in that space you're no longer reacting automatically. You're no longer pulled into every thought, every emotion, every interpretation. You begin to see things more clearly, not because you're analyzing more, but because you're interfering less. And when you interfere less, life reveals itself more honestly. You start to notice how many of your reactions were based on assumptions rather than reality. How often your mind filled in gaps with stories that felt real but weren't accurate. How many times you took something personally that had nothing to do with you. This is one of the quiet patterns that shape so much of your experience. The tendency to interpret everything through a personal lens. Someone speaks in a certain tone, and it feels like it reflects something about you. Someone doesn't respond quickly, and it feels like rejection. A small comment turns into something you carry with you, something you analyze, something you try to understand long after it has passed. But when you begin to step back and look at these moments more clearly, something becomes obvious. People are moving through their own worlds. Their thoughts, their concerns, their distractions, their emotions, all of these shape how they act far more than anything related to you. A short response might come from their own stress. A delay might come from their own priorities. A reaction might reflect their own perspective, not your worth. And yet, without awareness, you absorb it all. You take it in, you interpret it, you turn it into something personal. And in doing so, you carry weight that was never meant for you. But as you begin to see this pattern, you gain the ability to pause before taking things in, to question whether something truly belongs to you or whether you're simply picking it up out of habit. And more often than you expect, you'll realize that it doesn't belong to you at all. That realization is freeing, because it allows you to move through interactions without constantly defending yourself against things that were never directed at you. It allows you to stay grounded even when others are not. It allows you to respond with clarity instead of reacting from assumption. And over time, this changes the way you experience relationships. You become less reactive, less tense, less driven by the need to interpret everything. You listen more clearly. You respond more thoughtfully. You allow space for things to be what they are without immediately turning them into something more. And in that space, something genuine begins to form. Because when you're not constantly filtering everything through your own fears or expectations, you begin to see people more accurately. You begin to understand them more clearly, and your interactions become lighter, more real, less burdened by hidden tension. At the same time, your energy begins to stabilize. You're no longer adjusting your internal state based on every small change around you. You're no longer pulled in different directions by things that don't truly require your attention. Instead, there's a steadiness that begins to grow. Not a rigid kind of steadiness, but a flexible one. One that allows you to adapt without losing your center. One they don't chase. One they'd carry yourself by coming overwhelmed. And this steadiness becomes something you can rely on. Even when things don't go as planned. Even when people act in ways you didn't expect. Even when uncertainty appears. You begin to trust that you don't need to control everything to remain okay, that you don't need to anticipate every outcome to handle what comes, that you don't need to react to everything to stay engaged with life. And as that trust builds, something else begins to fade. The constant need to prepare for everything. For a long time, your mind may have believed that its job was to stay ahead of problems, to think through every possibility, to anticipate every outcome, to make sure nothing catches you off guard. It feels protective, it feels useful, but when it goes too far, it becomes exhausting, because instead of preparing you for reality, it keeps you living in imagined scenarios, running through situations that haven't happened, repeating possibilities that may never exist. And your body responds as if they are real. You feel tension, stress, urgency, even though nothing is actually happening in the present moment. And when you begin to see this clearly, you start to question it. You start to ask whether all of that mental effort is actually helping you. And often the answer is simple. It isn't. Because most of what you worry about never happens in the way you imagine. And even when something does happen, it often arrives in a form you didn't expect at all. So all of that time spent anticipating, analyzing, replaying it doesn't remove uncertainty. It just drains your energy before anything even begins. And when you realize that, something begins to shift. You stop treating every thought as something that needs to be followed. You begin to recognize when thinking is useful and when it has become repetitive. There's a point where thinking helps you understand something, and there's a point where it simply loops. Learning to see that difference changes everything. Because once you notice that a thought is no longer useful, you have the option to step away from it, not by forcing it to disappear, but by choosing not to continue engaging with it. At first, this feels unfamiliar. Your mind will try to pull you back in. It will suggest that you need to keep thinking, that you haven't figured it out yet, that there's something more to understand. But as you practice stepping back, even briefly, you begin to experience something new, a moment of quiet, a small release of tension. And over time, those moments begin to grow. They become more frequent, more natural, and your relationship with your thoughts begins to change. You no longer see them as commands that must be followed. You begin to see them as suggestions, as movements within the mind that can be observed without always being acted upon. Some of them are useful. Some of them deserve your attention. But many of them are simply habits repeating themselves. And the more clearly you see that, the less power they have over you. This doesn't mean your mind becomes silent. It doesn't mean challenges disappear. But it means you stop experiencing everything twice. Once in imagination and once in reality. Instead, you begin to meet things as they actually happen. And that alone removes a significant amount of unnecessary strain. Because you're no longer carrying the future before it arrives. You're no longer replaying the past as if it can be changed. You're here, in the present moment. And in that moment, something becomes clear. You don't need to solve everything in advance to handle what comes. You don't need to predict every outcome to respond effectively. You don't need to carry every possibility to be prepared. What you need is presence, the ability to meet each moment as it is, without adding layers that don't belong. And that presence becomes your strength, not because it gives you control over everything, but because it allows you to remain steady regardless of what happens. As this becomes more natural, your experience of life begins to feel different in a way that is hard to describe but easy to feel. There's less urgency, less pressure, less noise. You move through your day with more clarity, more focus, more ease. Things still happen. Challenges still arise, but they don't shake you in the same way, because you're no longer building your stability on things that are constantly changing. You're building it within yourself. And that changes everything. It changes how you think. It changes how you respond. It changes how you experience even the simplest moments. You begin to notice things you once overlooked. A quiet moment without needing to fill it. A conversation without needing to analyze it. An experience without needing to judge it. And in those moments, life feels lighter. Not because there's less happening, but because you're no longer carrying what doesn't need to be carried. You begin to understand something that was always true, but rarely seen clearly. Peace isn't something you find outside. It's something you allow by letting go of what disturbs it unnecessarily. And the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. Not as a technique, not as something you have to remember, but as a way of being. A way of moving through life with clarity instead of confusion, with steadiness instead of tension, with awareness instead of automatic reaction. And as this continues, something deeper begins to settle within you. A quiet confidence, not the kind that depends on everything going right, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle whatever happens. Because you're no longer relying on controlling the world. You're relying on understanding yourself, and that is something far more stable, something that stays with you in every moment, no matter what changes around you. And the more you begin to live from that place, the more you notice how unnecessary so much of your past tension really was. Not wrong, not foolish, just unnecessary. It came from a place of trying to protect yourself, trying to stay in control, trying to make life predictable. But life was never designed to be fully predictable. It moves. It shifts. It changes in ways you can't always see coming. And for a long time, you may have believed that your job was to stay ahead of all of it, to think more, prepare more, anticipate more. But now, something inside you is starting to understand a different truth. You don't need to stay ahead of life to live it well. You only need to meet it as it arrives. This changes how you move through even the most ordinary parts of your day. You wake up, and instead of immediately being pulled into everything that could happen, there's a small moment where you're simply present. No rush, no mental noise rushing in all at once. Just a quiet awareness of where you are. That moment may be brief at first, but it matters because it sets a different tone. Instead of starting your day already carrying weight, you begin with space. And from that space, everything unfolds differently. You move into your day, and situations arise as they always do. Conversations, decisions, small challenges, unexpected changes. But now, there's a subtle difference in how you meet them. You're not immediately pulled into reaction. You're not instantly trying to control the outcome. You see what's happening, and there's a small pause before you respond. That pause becomes your strength. It allows you to choose your response instead of being driven by habit, and in that choice there is clarity. You begin to notice how often reactions used to happen automatically, how quickly a thought would turn into an emotion, and that emotion would turn into an action, all without any space in between. Now that space exists, and in that space you're no longer controlled by every passing thought. You begin to see that thoughts come and go, but they don't all deserve your attention. Emotions rise and fall, but they don't all need to define your behavior. Some can simply pass, and as you allow that to happen, you start to feel something that was once rare, a sense of ease, not because everything is easy, but because you're no longer making everything harder than it needs to be. This ease begins to show up in places you might not expect. In your work, for example, there's less pressure behind everything you do. You still care, you still put in effort, but you're no longer carrying the constant weight of needing everything to turn out perfectly. You focus on what you can actually do, the effort you give, the attention you bring, the consistency you maintain, and you allow the rest to unfold. And interestingly, when you work this way, your results often improve, not because you're forcing them, but because your mind is clearer. Your energy is focused. You're not distracted by constant worry about outcomes. You're present in the process, and that presence changes the quality of everything. The same shift begins to appear in your relationships. You still care about people. You still show up. You still invest your time and energy, but you're no longer trying to control how they feel about you or how they respond. You stop trying to secure approval. You stop trying to avoid every possible misunderstanding. Instead, you allow interactions to be what they are, and in doing so, something more genuine begins to take shape. Because when you're not constantly managing how you're perceived, you become more authentic. You speak more honestly. You listen more fully. You connect without the hidden tension of trying to make everything go a certain way, and that changes everything. Your relationships become lighter, more real, more grounded. Not perfect, not without challenges, but free from the constant pressure you once placed on them. There's also a shift in how you experience quiet moments. Before, silence might have felt uncomfortable. Your mind would fill it immediately with thoughts, plans, worries. There was always something to think about, something to figure out. Now, silence begins to feel different. It becomes a place of rest, a moment where nothing needs to be added, where you don't need to analyze, fix, or improve anything. You can simply be. And in those moments, you begin to reconnect with something deeper, a sense of presence that doesn't depend on anything external, a calm that isn't fragile, a clarity that doesn't require constant effort. This doesn't mean your mind never becomes busy again. It will. Thoughts will still come. Emotions will still rise. Situations will still challenge you. But now you relate to them differently. You notice them sooner. You get pulled in less deeply. You return to clarity more quickly. And over time, this becomes your new baseline. Not perfection, but awareness. Not constant calm, but the ability to return to it. And that ability is what creates true stability. Because stability isn't about controlling everything so nothing goes wrong. It's about knowing you can handle things when they do. It's about trusting yourself, not the outcome. And that trust begins to grow naturally as you see it in action. You face a situation that once would have overwhelmed you, and you handle it with more clarity than before. You experience a moment that once would have triggered overthinking, and you let it pass more easily. You notice a thought that once would have taken over your mind, and you step back from it. Each of these moments builds something. A quiet confidence, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. A confidence that doesn't need everything to go right. A confidence that comes from knowing you don't fall apart when things don't. And as this confidence grows, something else begins to fade. The fear of uncertainty. Not completely, not all at once, but gradually. Because uncertainty is no longer something you need to eliminate. It becomes something you can move through. You begin to understand that not knowing is a natural part of life. That not everything needs to be figured out in advance. That clarity often comes from experience, not from endless thinking. And this understanding changes how you approach the future. You still plan when it's useful. You still think ahead when it serves a purpose. But you don't live there. You don't carry the future with you into every moment. You allow it to arrive when it arrives. And when it does, you meet it with presence, with awareness, with the same steadiness you've been building. And in that way, life begins to feel less like something you have to control and more like something you can move with. There's less resistance, less friction, less unnecessary struggle. You begin to flow with situations instead of pushing against them. And in that flow, there's a kind of quiet strength, a strength that doesn't come from force but from alignment, from no longer fighting what is, from no longer demanding that everything be different than it is in order for you to feel okay. And that is where a deeper sense of peace begins to settle. Not a temporary feeling, but a steady presence. Something that stays with you, even when things are uncertain, even when things are imperfect, even when life doesn't unfold the way you expected. Because your peace is no longer dependent on those things. It comes from how you relate to them, from what you choose to carry, from what you choose to let go. And as this becomes clearer, something important stands out. You were never meant to carry everything. You were never meant to manage every detail, control every outcome, absorb every emotion. That expectation was learned. And now it can be released. Not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, moment by moment, choice by choice. You let go of one unnecessary thought. You step back from one automatic reaction. You release one expectation that was creating pressure. And each time you do, you create more space, more clarity, more ease, and over time, those small changes become something much bigger. A different way of living, a way that feels lighter, more natural, more aligned with how life actually works. And in that way of living, something becomes very clear. Peace was never something you had to chase. It was something that was already there beneath everything you were carrying. And as you let those things go, even slowly, even imperfectly, that peace begins to reveal itself, more and more, until one day you realize something that once felt impossible. You're no longer overwhelmed by everything. You're no longer pulled in every direction. You're no longer carrying what was never yours. You're here, present, steady, clear, and quietly at peace. And from that place you can move through anything, not because you control it, but because you no longer need to.